There's a moment in every major life change that most people overlook, and it reveals something fascinating about human beings. We're incredibly adaptable, but we rarely notice when adaptation is actually happening. Think about the last major change in your life: a new job, a move, a relationship shift, even a new daily routine. At first, everything feels unfamiliar. Small things take more effort. Decisions take longer. You're slightly more aware of yourself. But then something small happens, so minor in fact that we don't notice. Without realizing it, you begin to stabilize. And that strange part is this: most people don't observe the moment their life becomes normal again. You see this process in everyday situations. Someone starts a new job. The first week feels intense. They're learning systems, remembering names, trying to understand expectations. Everything requires attention. But a few months later, they walk into the office without thinking about it. They know where things are. They know how conversations usually go. What once felt unfamiliar has incrementally become routine. That same thing happens after larger life changes. And the funny thing is, this pattern shows up everywhere. People move to a new city. At first, everything feels disorientating. Different streets, different rhythms, different routines. But eventually, they find their grocery store, their coffee shop, their favorite walking route. And slowly, the unfamiliar world becomes predictable again. I remember noticing this process in my own life. When I moved into my new apartment after my divorce, the first night felt strange. The walls were unfamiliar, the sounds were different, even the silence felt different. I didn't quite know where things belonged yet. The kitchen cabinets were empty, the furniture wasn't arranged, nothing had rhythm. But over time, slight, insignificant changes were made. I hung a picture on the wall. I developed a morning routine. I learned how the light moves through the room in the afternoon. And one day I realized something discreetly shifted. The place that once felt temporary and foreign now felt like home. There was no big reveal, just small adjustments repeated over time. I became acclimated. There's actually a psychological explanation for this. Psychologists refer to it as adaptation. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to recalibrate their expectations and emotional responses after change. One concept related to this is called the hedonic adaptation. Researchers studying happiness have found that after major positive or negative life events, people tend to gradually return to a relatively stable emotional baseline. Not because the event stops mattering, but because the mind slowly recognizes itself around the new reality. The brain rebuilds patterns, routines return, familiarity grows. And eventually, what once felt disruptive becomes part of the background of your daily life. In other words, the mind quietly learns how to live there. And once you start noticing this, you see it everywhere. This stabilization process shows up across many areas of life. In careers, someone steps into a new role that carries more responsibility than they've ever had before. At first, something feels amplified. Emails take longer to answer because every response feels like it matters more. Decisions feel heavier. Even small choices carry the question, am I handling this the right way? There's often a period where they double check everything. They watch how others respond. They notice how meetings flow. They mentally replay conversations after they happen. But over time, something shifts. They start recognizing patterns. Certain problems repeat. Certain conversations follow familiar scripts. The role that once required constant mental effort becomes something that they can navigate more naturally. not because the job changed, but because their mind built a framework for it. In relationships, two people might begin a relationship feeling slightly unsure around each other. There's a certain self-awareness in the beginning. How often should I text? Did that joke land the right way? Am I being too much or not enough? There's a lot of silent calibration happening. Both people are learning each other's signals. But after enough shared moments, something changes faintly. The rhythm of the other person's humor becomes easier to read. You start recognizing the tone that means, I've had a long day. The habit of analyzing every interaction fades. And before you know it, there are inside jokes, comfortable silence. The relationship has developed its own internal language. It even shows up in something deeper. You see it with identity changes too. When someone shifts direction in life, a new career, a new belief system, a different way of living, the early period can feel strangely fragile because the version of themselves that fits this new direction is still taking shape. People might catch themselves explaining their choices more than usual or hesitating when someone asks, "So, what are you doing these days?" Because the story is still being written. But gradually, the explanation becomes simpler. The person stops rehearsing how to describe themselves. They stop comparing the new version of their life to the old one. And eventually, the new direction stops feeling like a transition, and it starts feeling more like who they are. And what's interesting is that in all of these situations, the stabilization feels like it came from one big magical realization. But it really wasn't. It came from repetition. From small moments the brain quietly adjusted to, moments you didn't recognize at the time. Gradually, it learned how to interpret those minor changes, until one day the situation that once required constant adjustment feels surprisingly steady. And when you step back and look at all of these situations together, when you zoom out for a second, a pattern begins to appear. In each one, the beginning feels slightly uncertain. People pay attention to everything, their words, their timing, the reactions around them. But over time, something subtle changes. Not the situation itself, their interpretation of it. The brain starts recognizing patterns. Certain conversations repeat, certain reactions become predictable, certain signals begin to make sense. And once the mind understands the pattern, the situation stops feeling unfamiliar. What once required constant attention starts moving into the background. Not because everything became perfect, but because the mind finally understands how the environment works. And that understanding is often the moment stability begins to return. And this raises an interesting thought. When we're in the middle of change, we often assume the instability will last forever. We think, this doesn't feel normal. This is weird. This doesn't feel like me. But the mind has a cool tendency to recognize itself, almost the way water finds its level. Given enough time, people usually develop new rhythms, new expectations, new ways of standing in their lives. Which means the question isn't always, will things feel stable again? The real question should be, what kind of stability am I slowly building now? Maybe the important thing to remember during times of change is this. Stability rarely arrives all at once. It forms through repetition, through small routines, through familiar moments that slowly accumulate, until one day the life that once felt unfamiliar feels ordinary again. And sometimes that soft return to steadiness is the most powerful sign that adaptation is working. Here's your sip of the day. Sometimes the biggest sign you've adapted is the moment you stop thinking about the change. Before we close, if this channel has slowly become part of your routine, has become a steady place for you during the week, you're always welcome to subscribe or leave a comment about what resonated with you today. Those small things help this conversation reach someone else who might need it, and it's at no cost to you. And if you ever feel like supporting the channel more directly, there's also a donation option, or you can pick up something from our shop linked below. But mostly, I'm glad you're here. And if this conversation resonated with you, you might also enjoy the rest of the Shoreline series. Human beings are remarkably good at rebuilding their footing. Even after uncertainty, even after disruption, even after the change that once felt overwhelming. Because over time, the unfamiliar becomes navigable, the unstable becomes manageable, and eventually, life finds a rhythm again. If this episode gave you something to reflect on, you can subscribe to Caffeine and Clarity for more conversations like this. And if you've ever noticed the moment when something unfamiliar finally started feeling normal, I'm curious to hear about it. Until next time.